After the accident, I realized I wasn't the one in control. I've lived with the voice for 11 years now. 11 years since I first heard the pained whispers drift up from the back of my mind. 11 years since the accident. I don't remember much from before the wreck, probably about the same amount any person does from their first 7 years of life. But I do recall every detail of the day that everything changed for me. Maybe the trauma of it all seared it into my memories. My mother, Dr. Vivian Graves, was driving me home from soccer practice through the winding, fog-shrouded roads of Black Hollow. Some of her hair was draped over the back of the headrest. I was seated behind her, and when she refused to stop for ice cream, I grabbed a handful of the dark strands and tugged hard. Distracted for a moment by the sudden pain in her scalp and turning to yell at me, she ran a stop sign. I'll never forget the look of terror on the young woman's face in the other car as she was about to T-bone us, nor her screaming expression turning toward the back seat just before the collision. My father, Dr. Marcus Graves, was on the board of the highest-rated hospital in the city, and he ensured that we received the best surgeons and the best treatment. The passengers in the other vehicle, a young mother and her 2 sons, were not so lucky. Still, it was a miracle that I survived. The impact was right behind our car's driver's door, right where I was sitting. I should have been crushed, but I did not emerge completely unscathed from the incident. My body was mangled beyond repair, my face shredded by broken glass and twisted metal, my larynx battered to permanently alter my voice, my eyes damaged such that I was declared legally blind, though losing the majority of my sight was probably for the best, as I was unrecognizable. With extremely powerful glasses, I was able to see just enough of my reflection to recoil in horror the only time that I ever felt brave enough to look into the mirror with them on. My parents found me sobbing in the restroom and calling myself a monster that morning. A few days later, they told me that we were moving away, that they were wanting to avoid me having to return to school and the onslaught of difficult questions or cruel ridicule from the children that knew me before. Clear across the country, we went from west coast to east, leaving everything behind, including all of the photographs of me taken prior to the accident, which, my mother and father explained, they did as a kindness, to avoid any reminders of how I used to look. We were starting a new life, and they seemed intent on addressing the accident and my disfigurement from it as little as possible. In fact, it seemed at times that they wanted to pretend that it never happened. My mother sustained some superficial damage as well, but she became expertly adept at hiding her scars with makeup, and both of my parents refused to elaborate to anyone that inquired about my injuries other than to say we were in a car wreck, that I was a perfectly normal little boy whose physical wounds shouldn't define him, and that they would discuss it no further. Often, I appreciated their attitude, as they worked fiercely to ensure that my childhood was no different than any other. But there were days that I wished they would at least be willing to talk to me about it. Like the night that I first heard the voice. 6 months after the accident, we were settled into our new home in Black Hollow, and I wasn't quite yet adjusted to my surroundings. So, it was not a surprise when I awoke in the pitch black of my room at some point in the middle of the night. Without my glasses, I wasn't able to see the numbers on the clock to tell me exactly what time it was, but the chirp of crickets outside my window and the absolute absence of light told me that it was well beyond my bedtime. And it wouldn't have much mattered if I could see the clock anyway, as I was unable to turn my head to face it. My body was frozen. No matter how much effort I exerted, I couldn't even wiggle a finger. I was petrified. My breaths came rapidly and I tried to call out for my parents, but my vocal cords refused to vibrate. And then, I heard it. "Who are you?" A childlike whisper grated through my head, a voice simultaneously familiar and completely foreign, originating from somewhere in the depths of my brain. "What?" I replied in thought, still unable to speak aloud. "You shouldn't be here." It sounded just as frightened as I was, trembling, near to tears. Then, without warning, my left arm moved, absent my command, or me willing it to do so. I felt it raise up off the bed and ball its hand into a fist. Open and closed, open and closed, the fingers curled in and out as if trying to grasp something in the air. "You shouldn't be here!" the voice screamed at me, and in instinctual self-preservation, I yelled back at it in my mind. "Stop! Leave me alone!" willing it to go away with every ounce of strength in my tiny body. And my arm fell back to my side. Then suddenly, as quickly as it had come on, my paralysis lifted. Sweating profusely, I threw my covers off and ran for my parents' bedroom as quickly as I could. One small benefit to my new condition was that I could navigate much more easily in the dark than others. Most days, I didn't even bother with my glasses as they gave me a headache, and I got very used to finding my way without the benefit of sight. The route from my room to my mother and father's was already memorized, and I was shaking them awake less than a minute after regaining my mobility. It wasn't easy for me to explain to them what had happened, as they were having to translate the hysterical words I managed to gasp out through fierce hyperventilation. But eventually, they pieced together my story of the voice and how I briefly lost control of my body. I expected that they'd be scared too, that they might even take me to the hospital. Yet I was shocked when they barely reacted. It's not as if they were cold and uncaring. They did comfort me. My mother rubbed my back while my father described sleep paralysis, saying that that was very likely what I'd experienced. And they kept repeating that it was a perfectly normal thing. Even as a young child, I could tell there was something wrong with their logic. Dad noted that sleep paralysis could involve hallucinations, accounting for the voice, and a loss of motor function, accounting for me waking up frozen. However, it didn't elucidate how my arm had moved on its own, or the strange grasping motion it kept repeating. He had no answers for that, other than to tell me that I was okay, that I was safe, that the voice hadn't hurt me, and that the worst part of the experience was only the fear it induced. But he did warn me that it might happen again, and with his warning, he tendered some advice. If the voice comes back and you find that you're not in control anymore, just do exactly what you did tonight, okay? Tell it to go away and that you're in charge, he said. And, with no other guidance or plans on how to deal with it, when it did return again and again, that's exactly what I did. As I grew, I learned to live with it. Neither of my parents were willing to discuss it beyond that first night other than to reiterate my father's instructions, and it only infrequently impacted my existence. By the time I was 12, I had heard it on 9 different occasions, always at night, always awaking me from a deep sleep. The physical manifestations were identical each instance, complete immobility other than my phantom arm grasping at the air. But the phrases it wormed through my mind changed. Not fair, leave, your fault, stolen. However, every time it looped back around to, you shouldn't be here. And though on each intrusion I was able to fend it off by telling it to leave and that I was in control, every occurrence resulted in pure terror for me. No matter how many times my parents repeated that it was sleep paralysis and there was nothing to fear long term, I was still worried that one day it might take over for good. That one day, I would become a passenger in my own body, especially considering that I didn't understand why it was happening. As I mentioned, I didn't have many memories from before the accident, but I was certain that it had never happened before then. I surmised that there must have been something about the wreck that triggered it, and it wasn't until 5 years after it happened that I first heard the term survivor's guilt. My mother was watching a daytime talk show, and they were interviewing guests that had survived traumatic accidents, one of whom described something similar to what I was experiencing. A voice in their head, nagging them for still being alive when others had died. Listening to their story, I found myself empathizing with them. Maybe subconsciously I was punishing myself for causing the accident by distracting my mother. Maybe, you shouldn't be here, was the voice telling me that I shouldn't be alive when it was my fault that other people weren't. But it wasn't a perfect fit for everything the voice said. What did it mean when it told me to leave, or said, stolen? It was more difficult to view those words through the lens of survivor's guilt. Yet it was the best theory I had, and the one that I carried until I was 15. Until I met my best friend Jasper Kane in freshman homeroom. The first real friend that I made after the wreck. He didn't care how disfigured my face was or that I couldn't see. A bit of an outcast himself, we quickly bonded, and I shared everything about myself with him, including the details of how I received my injuries, and of the whispers in my head. My father had told me, explicitly, that I should never speak about the voice to anyone else. Really, he told me never to speak of it at all, but especially not to mention it outside of our house. However, I trusted Jasper implicitly. He'd told me about his struggles at home, about his mom's drinking, and his dad's neglect. I didn't think it fair to hold back any details of my life from him. So, it was Jasper that gave me my second theory on the origins of the voice, as he didn't agree that it was a simple case of survivor's guilt. He suspected an attachment. Jasper was much more into the world of the dark and creepy than I was. He suggested that the spirit of the boy that had perished in the other vehicle may have searched for the nearest living body it could find after it had been ripped from its own and crept inside. In his words, inhabitation was a much better explanation for what was happening to me than survivor's guilt. And for the first time, I considered that possibly what I was hearing wasn't a manifestation from my own mind, but was someone else speaking with me. It would explain why the voice hadn't aged with me over time, why every night that it returned to me, it still sounded like a scared and angry child. And I had to admit that every phrase the voice had uttered made more sense when viewed from that angle. We theorized that the boy's soul didn't understand what had happened to it, that on nights when I was particularly vulnerable, fast asleep and emotionally peaceful, it could push me aside and briefly gain control of my body, that it was confused and thought I was the intruder. Leave! Stolen! You shouldn't be here! But, though it illuminated why the voice might be saying some of the things that it was, our hypothesis also pointed to a grim conclusion. The boy wanted me out. My fear of one day becoming a guest within my own body grew. Previously, I'd worried that it was just my own brain that would disconnect its physical control from my mental directions. But now I pondered the frightful possibility that there was a spirit trapped within me that was actively trying to take over. However, in addition to the dread, the prospect also filled me with a deep sadness. As the voice had forcefully reminded me several times, it was my fault that it was in this situation. I had distracted my mother. I had caused the accident. It would still be happily residing in its original host, if not for me. I asked Jasper if there was anything we could do to try and free it, surmising that sending it on would be preferable for it than forever residing in an alien world. He recommended that we try a Ouija board, thinking that we could contact the imprisoned soul and help it comprehend what had happened, thinking we might even be able to get it to leave once it realized that it did not belong in this world anymore. Yet, over the next 3 years, we made more than 50 attempts to communicate with the spirit directly, resulting in more than 50 failures. No matter the time of day, the ambiance we set, the music, the scents, the incantations, the boy would not speak to us, but he still came to me at night. 8 more visits during those 3 years, each time angrier than the last. Leave, stolen, mine. And each time he became harder to push out, each time he held control for longer. Jasper was sleeping at my house during the most recent episode and was nearly killed when he attempted to stop the possession. He had awoken to the distressed noises of me struggling for power over my faculties and saw my arm rise from the bed, making the repetitive, squeezing motion I detailed to him. Knowing what was happening, he tried to shake me from the trance, but was unsuccessful in rattling me free. And then, I witnessed my own body attack him. Throttling blows landed on Jasper's chest and face. I sprang from the bed and pinned him to the floor. Hands that I couldn't stop wrapped themselves around his throat and began to crush down on his windpipe. Leave! I'm in control! Leave! I'm in control! I shouted inside my head, desperately trying to regain power over my fingers before the life drained from Jasper's face. And mercifully, I felt my grasp begin to loosen just as his eyes were rolling back in his head. Collapsing onto the floor next to Jasper, I heard him coughing and gasping for air while the voice screamed a final, defiant appeal before it receded to the depths of my consciousness. Give it back. Neither Jasper nor I slept the remainder of that night. I apologized over and over for what I'd done to him, but he told me that it wasn't necessary. He knew that it wasn't really me that had attacked him. Yet he began to withdraw from our friendship. Up to that point, I think Jasper had found my affliction to be a curiosity, something fun and mysterious to investigate. However, the attack had exposed the true reality of it to him, and he became just as afraid of it as I was. And any time that I asked him to hang out after that night, he made an excuse. The voice took the only real friend that I had in the world, and it made me furious. 11 years had passed since the accident. 11 years the voice had been punishing me for my mistake. I needed to be free of it. So, I decided to share my story online on several paranormal forums, asking if anyone could help, looking for a medium or maybe even an exorcist that could pry the unwelcome spirit from me. And yesterday, someone responded. "I've been looking for you," began the cryptic message in my inbox. "It's not a spirit you're hearing." Below those words, 2 photographs were pasted. One of my parents with me before the accident, and one of a young woman with 2 boys. A screaming face flashed through my mind, the young woman moments before her car impacted ours. And here she was again, smiling with her sons flanking her on either side. The older boy, I didn't recognize, but the younger. The younger was familiar. I flicked between the 2 photos and realized how similar my younger self looked to her younger son. Similar age, similar hair color, similar eye color. We might pass for brothers too. But it wasn't just our similarities that bothered me. It had been over 10 years since I'd looked into a mirror with my glasses on. 10 years since I'd seen my face clearly. Or was it his face? I closed my eyes and forced the blurry image from that morning up out of the depths of my memories, and my pulse quickened when it came into focus. Beneath the heavy scarring, under the swelling and bruises, it wasn't the face of the boy with my parents reflected back at me. It was his. Shaking, I took my laptop with me to the nearest bathroom and looked at myself directly for the first time in a decade. Then, maximizing the image of the mother and her boys on the screen, I imagined what the younger would have looked like aged 18, and he stared back at me in the mirror. That moment, a splitting headache ripped through my skull, and I dropped to the floor. Grasping my head, I shrieked in pain while a series of images cascaded through my brain. I was seeing the accident again, though not from my perspective. I was seeing it from his. My mother's car flew into the intersection, and it was too late for his mother to stop. She screamed and reached for the back seat where he was seated, and he stretched forward with his left hand to grab her arm. He was closing his fist to squeeze it just as the impact threw her through the windshield, and an instant later, everything went black. He awoke in the hospital weeks later, but was no longer the one in charge of his body. A new director had been installed. I'd been installed. The boy could hear my thoughts. He could see my memories. He knew an invader had taken control of his life, but he was powerless to do anything about it. And he watched as a man he didn't recognize shook hands with a surgeon, thanking him for saving his son's life, thanking him for being willing to perform such a radical procedure in order to do it. As the pain in my head began to wane, and the scene from the hospital was replaced with the bathroom tile I'd toppled onto, I finally understood what the voice was. I understood what my father had done. I understood why my parents had never taken me to a doctor or to therapy to address the voice. Why they had been so firm in their assertions that I tell it that I was in charge whenever it returned. They already knew what it was. In the boy's memories, it was a neurosurgeon that my father was shaking hands with. They were old friends. He was the one that saved my life, though he'd only saved part of me. The other boy hadn't perished that day, as they'd all lied to me. I had, all but my brain, which they transferred to the surviving boy's body. He wasn't the intruder. I was. Lying there on the cold bathroom floor, my mind reeled with the horrifying truth that it was now burdened with. I'd made the boy a prisoner in his own body. Sobbing, I pulled myself to my feet and looked again at the anonymous message that had shattered my reality. And I found a few more, short sentences beneath the photos. "You killed my mother. You stole my brother's body. I will find you. I don't know what to do. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I crushed my glasses last night, never wanting to catch even a glimpse of my face again. I thought about trying to share control with my roommate, but beyond having no idea how go about that, I'm terrified of what he'll do if I give him the reins. Because now that I know for sure he's in there, now that I know the voice isn't survivor's guilt or a wayward spirit, I can feel him. He's stewing there in the back of our head, scared, furious, mutinous. He knows his brother is looking for him, and he's fighting to take over.